And according to my clock, it is 9:30 exactly. Very warm welcome to today's and final edition of On the Agenda for 2020 with a topic that couldn't be more timely: rule of law at what cost? My name is Kaddik. I'm the Executive Director of the European Liberal Forum, the foundation of the European Liberals, and a network of now 47 think tanks and foundations all across Europe working together for a liberal and united Europe. And I'm very glad to see two of our members today in this webinar. As I said, this topic couldn't be more timely. We've had a discussion already before this webinar started, because we saw yesterday the talks about how to deal with the rule of law mechanism in order to get out of the deadlock around the MFF and the COVID-19 rescue plan. Full disclosure, and in my humble opinion, the way it looks right now is pretty dire. I think from a liberal perspective, from a rule of law perspective, this suggestion of postponing the implementation of the rule of law mechanism is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that the EU, that the member states, that the EU citizens, but especially also the citizens of Hungary and Poland, are taken hostage by this situation, by the leaders in Poland and Hungary. And I don't want to even imagine the consequences that this might have in light of the erosion of European values, especially in the east of the European Union, and the erosion in the trust of the people in the European Union, especially in the east of the European Union. But these are just some personal reflections. And before I get too emotional and too deep into the topic, I would like to hand over to our fantastic moderator of the On the Agenda series, Beatriz Rios, who is today again presenting and moderating the panel. She's an amazing EU affairs reporter, but more importantly, she has been guiding us through the events of On the Agenda of this year. So in the name of the entire team, of the entire European Liberal Forum, Beatriz, thank you so much for what you've done. And I'm so much looking forward to A, the work that we'll be doing next year together, and B, today's discussion. And with that, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for those very kind words. It is indeed a very timely topic, the one that we're going to be discussing today. The European Council is meeting today, and they will be discussing this issue and how it is blocking the negotiation over the next multi-annual financial framework and the recovery fund. I was thinking right now, and this is something that I would definitely throw into the conversation, that this link between access to EU funds and the rule of law was actually meant to stop this authoritarian drift in many countries in the EU, and it has turned to be an issue the other way around. They have managed to block their negotiations over the money to try to actually prevent this from happening and keep on doing what they were doing up until now. But the more interesting part of this discussion is definitely not my personal views on it, but the views that our speakers will be sharing today. So I don't want to take much more of your time. I'm just going to throw some housekeeping rules so that you know we are filming this webinar. We're also live on Facebook. If you want to take part, if you want to ask some questions to our speakers, you can leave them in our Q&A chat box. We will be monitoring it and throwing them into the conversation in a minute. But before, I'm going to give the floor to our speakers for a first introductory remark, and I would like to give the floors first to Richard John. His PhD in Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe and Professor of International Relations at the University of Warwick. Please, Richard, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. To start us off, I want to make 4 arguments pitched as a way to stir up some debate. Some of my reflections may have been slightly overtaken by yesterday's events, if it's indeed the case that there may now be an agreement, but I think some of them still have some broader political relevance. Argument number 1, we were asked whether moving from unanimity to majority voting is necessary and a good thing. I wanted to add a word of caution on this. I think clearly in a case like this, it is extremely frustrating that we have the unanimity requirement, and a move to majority voted would clearly be good for liberal outcomes. But I'm not sure that in general, a move to majority voting is a panacea. I'm not sure that it always offers quite the easy solution it sometimes promises, and it could bring in its wake a number of problems of its own. Of course, the very fact that it's so necessary makes the move away from unanimity so difficult to implement in practice. As I say, of course, in a case like this, majority voting would have produced or could have produced a better outcome for liberal values. But of course, that is not always the case. Once you open the Pandora's box of majority voting, you can't limit it just to one issue where your own points of view would be given a more favorable outcome. It may be that on other occasions, a more liberal minority could be outvoted, and therefore a liberal agenda could actually suffer from a move away from unanimity to majority voting. We know from opinion polling that there is a problem with the perceived legitimacy of the EU in many member states. Polls show that people are strongly in favor of their countries being members of the EU, but they do express concern about their voice not being heard in a fair way in European decision making. And it may be that if we move away from unanimity to majority voting, there is a perception of decisions being imposed on populations in a way that is not fair and inadvertently backfiring in terms of local support for European integration. So I think those concerns need to be borne in mind. In a way, these debates about majority voting can tend to go round in a rather self-referential circle. Measures to get rid of unanimity themselves require unanimity. So that's why we tend to not get any progress on this issue, not just on the rule of law question, but on other questions as well. So I'm not saying by any of that that I would be against a move to majority voting in many areas, just to add a slight caveat that it doesn't necessarily point towards more favorable outcomes in all cases. That leads on to my second question. It seems to me that the broader lesson from this episode is to reinforce the case for in the longer term, a more flexible model of European integration. I think the enhanced cooperation option here would have been extremely difficult and messy and very ad hoc, but perhaps there is a case for standing back and planning in a more preemptive way, a slightly different and more differentiated, flexible approach to European integration, one based more on a logic of opting in rather than opting out. At the moment, we have the assumption that everybody participates in all areas of policy unless there's a reason to opt out. And one could imagine a situation where at least in a modest number of policy areas, there is deeper cooperation set up and well funded, and then states opt into that, but on the condition that they accept fully the kind of political liberal values that are so in doubt, have been so in doubt in this case. My point here is that I think this is not just about Hungary and Poland on the specific issue of rule of law. It's that there needs to be a much broader debate about the model of integration. There are many reasons I think that speak in favor of this more flexible model of integration. This is just one of them, but I think it does reinforce the need for a broader debate about the kind of structural parameters of European integration. So that's my second point. My third point was to suggest that we need to clarify what the most important aim is, or to distinguish between different aims. If the aim is to unblock the impasse over the recovery fund, that's one thing. It clearly speaks in favor of moving away from unanimity. If the aim is to incentivize democratic change in Hungary and Poland, I think that's a much more complicated question. It may be that it's entirely justified to move towards much tougher measures to some degree on Hungary and Poland, but we should also be aware that incentivizing change from outside is a very complex matter. In Carnegie, I work in a democracy program, and our work on democracy shows over many, many years that adopting very punitive approaches from the outside doesn't always work in favor of democratic change. It can under certain conditions. But we do need to be careful and recognize that building constituencies in favor of democratic change or redemocratization is very complex, and I think goes beyond simply the question of isolating one or two states or implementing more punitive measures. Let's not forget the lessons from the early 2000s in many Central and Eastern European countries is that you can get compliance around democratic values from governments without underlying values in societies necessarily moving in the same direction. I think we need to take that caveat in mind as a lesson from the last 10 or 15 years. Again, I'm not saying that a tougher approach in some ways is not justified, but it doesn't necessarily suffice as a very sophisticated approach for generating democratic change in countries like Hungary and Poland. Which leads on to my fourth and final argument, which is that although all the political attention is on these ways of isolating countries like Hungary and Poland and exerting firmer pressure, it may be that policy instruments that offer a slightly more indirect way of coming at this problem may be more important and more constructive over the longer term. And here I'm thinking about instruments like the values instruments, the funding that is being made available to try and support democratic actors in countries like Hungary and Poland and other member states as well. Of course, this kind of indirect approach of trying to support democratic actors on the ground is not as dramatic as the big summit debates about QMV and about isolating particular member states. But I do think we also need this longer term approach of how you empower democratic actors and build broader coalitions for political change. So they're my four arguments that I put on the table to start some debate off.
Thank you very much. I think definitely there are a lot of questions that we're going to discuss today, and I think the question of trying to achieve a more flexible form of integration is one of the big questions that we have seen over the past few years in relation to what's going on in Poland and Hungary, but not only there. And I'm very much looking forward to hear from our other panelists about this question of how do we enforce democracy and values in Poland, in Hungary, and in other countries as well, when we have this drift from the outside. And what do they think about this soft approach by supporting democratic actors in the country? So I'd like to hear from them. I'm going to give the floor next to Andrea Birak. She's the Director of Strategy of Republican Institute in Hungary. So please, Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. And let me thank the European Liberal Forum for organizing this event. Indeed, it is a very interesting time in the European Union, mainly due to what the governments of Poland and Hungary are doing. And first, let me try to explain a little bit why the Hungarian government is doing this whole veto thing, because I know that from outside Hungary, it is not always easy to understand the Hungarian Prime Minister's actions. First of all, the government's reasoning behind vetoing everything in the European Union basically is that they say that the rule of law mechanism is just a tool in Brussels, as they say, in Brussels' hands to force illegal migration, open society, gender ideology, and liberalism on Hungary. And clearly the Hungarian voters reject those ideas. So the Hungarian government has to fight against such tools, and they have to fight against it to be able to resist migration, open society, and so on. As they say, financial matters and ideology should be separated. Thus, the rule of law mechanism shouldn't be accepted. So that's their logic. This is what they have been saying in Hungary for weeks, or actually for months now. But of course, this is just communication, and this is just the narrative that they want to enforce. I think the real motivation behind this is First, the first motivation is to make the fight against the European Union the main topic of Hungarian politics. This fits the pattern of constant fighting against someone, mainly the European Union, against George Soros, against migration. They always create an enemy, they fight it, and then they claim that they are defending Hungary against foreign enemies. So this debate with the European Union fits their pattern perfectly and combines the European Union, migration, and George Soros into one complex question. So it's kind of perfect for the Hungarian government. The second reason is to divert the attention away from the COVID-19 pandemic, for sure. I think now in Hungary we can say the response to the pandemic is not so successful. So for the government, it was very useful to have another topic that they can control, not like the pandemic now in Hungary. And the third reason behind it, I think that they got really scared of the rule of law mechanism is a real threat to the government, especially in the years or the year before the election. Of course, as you might know, we will have general elections in 2022. So facing the danger of losing EU funds in 2021 was a real threat, or is a real threat for the Hungarian government. So of course they decided to do everything in order to prevent that from happening. I'm sure we will get into more details because I have some data on how the Hungarian voters perceive this whole issue and everything. So I will get into more details later. As a closing point, I just want to say that that in light of yesterday's news that an agreement is in our sight. Now every political side, both the opposition and the government party claiming victory right now in Hungary. So it won't be easy for Hungarian voters to really interpret and really understand what is happening right now at the European Union.
Thank you, Andrea. I think it was very interesting, this idea of the EU as some sort of a scapegoat for everything that happens to Hungary, and how this has been something that the government has constantly used to build their own narrative of we are the protector of Hungary. And I definitely think that we could get into more details about how they have used this before to do all the reforms that have put in danger the actual functioning of the democracy in the country. I would like to give the floor now to Blazej Lenkowski. I'm sorry for the pronunciation, please. He's the president of Fundacja Liberté and publisher of Liberté in Poland. So please, Blazej, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I know that my name is really difficult for anyone outside from Poland. Well, I would like to start with, I think, a Polish attitude of Polish opposition to this possible veto, because this is really, I think, important for Poland and its future. I think that this veto, in response to the introduction of the rule of law principle, may be the beginning of events really concerning and changing the future of Republic of Poland. And I think that many people in Poland are aware of this situation. For this reason, of course, Poland will not leave the EU immediately or not be thrown out of it. However, I'm sure that if it will happen, that it will be the end of the long process of wide support of economic transformation in Poland by Western countries, and the beginning of the process of step-by-step removing of our country from these key areas of Western structures and help. I think that both opposition and, in paradox, the ruling party in Poland is aware of this problem, and all this game made by a Morawiecki government is a kind of a game, and I think that everyone should be aware of it. This case is especially important because from the one side we are talking about European solidarity in the times of pandemic. I think that the economies and the citizens of EU today have a great need for joint action, for funds to save companies, for solidarity in the name of the crisis. And in such a situation, the Polish budget veto is something much more than just negotiating a specific legal provision. This clearly shows that Poland would be not ready to act for good of the entire community. It is very important. It shows that Poland is ready to cause serious harm for citizens of all EU countries for the sake of the political interest of the ruling party, who wants to obtain just international consent to continue violating the law and principles of the rule of law in Poland. The Morawiecki's government, because his name will go down in the history as the man who vetoed the EU budget, is also ready to condemn Polish citizens to much harder and longer path of economic recovery after the pandemic crisis. And this will be specific bankruptcies, specific unrealized investments, and more just people's problems and tragedies. Just for what? Only for the unlimited lust of power by this Polish government. Well, if we are wondering if this special recovery fund can be established in future without the participation of Poland or Hungary, I think that of course it can, and in my opinion it will happen after this possible veto. It will be supported by a coalition of supporters of this deeper integration of Western core of Union, a bit skeptical towards our region, and at the same time by idealists who will want to rightly punish Poland for such acting in a crisis. So this may be the beginning of really deep, I think, tectonic changes in European structures, very bad changes, which will lead to the systematical change and transfer the key financial activities from EU institutions to other structures that will be functioning without Poland, Hungary, and maybe other countries of the region. This is, in my opinion, very dangerous, not only for Poland and Hungary, but at the same time for the whole Union. The scenario will be very, very bad for for all parties, and I think that we should invest a lot of energy to avoid it. Mateusz Morawiecki, with his veto, will strike not only the Polish and European reset debt, but also, in my opinion, it will lead to, this is interesting also, I think for you, the end of his political career. His role in the government, in this united right, law and justice camp, was to be perceived as efficient, effective in terms of European policy, making quite reasonable economic policy and proving to the world that Polish radicals are not so irrational. His work was to be this kind of good face of this para-authoritarian government. He was supposed to be the voice of reason in this law and justice camp. And now Morawiecki, taking over the narrative and actions of his main political enemy in government camp, the Minister of Justice, Zbigniew Ziobro, is obviously digging his own political grave. Jarosław Kaczyński will not need Morawiecki after this veto. So I think that Morawiecki, in interests of Morawiecki, his own interest is not to veto this budget. So, in my opinion, of course, veto is absolutely harmful Of course, the agreement and compromise in the interests of all parties, including Poland, is needed. As Polish citizen, as Polish patriot, caring for well-being of my country, I consider the possibility of not adapting the budget for coming years. This is really bad and a kind of tragedy for Poland and also for EU. Also, the possibility of not including Poland in the recovery fund as a revenge for the veto will have very negative impact for Polish economy. However, it must be said that all fault, all blame for possible not achieving the compromise and agreement will be on Polish and Hungarian side. I have no doubts about it. The European Union cannot negotiate the rule of law. There cannot be negotiation with the rule of law in a community built on democratic values. This is important to send a very clear message to governments acting like Polish government for law and justice, that EU will not accept breaking the law and actions taken in Poland during the last 5 years towards Constitutional Court and other institutions. For me, as Polish citizens and Democrat, is very, very important. Now we are hearing that this compromise is near and possible, but we need to know particulars to assess it. I will be more than happy if Polish government will not use the veto, an agreement will be made. This is reasonable and needed solution, but at the same time, I really hope that rule of law will not be sacrificed by German presidency and the rest of EU countries. This postponing this rule for the future, I think that is not solution, and it will not help democracy in Poland. So it is my introduction.
Thank you so much. I think it was very interesting the fact that you mentioned this internal political dimension that we're not so much aware sometimes from the EU in Poland, and the role that Morawiecki is playing in this whole thing, but also the fact that, and I think this is a very interesting and reflection, because it's a reflection that the whole European Union is having, is to what extent this spat over the budget and the rule of law is indeed an existential threat to the European Union itself, to its structure, because it's putting in question the basis on which the European Union is funded. And it's definitely a discussion that member states need to have. When I was listening to both of you, Andrea and Blazej, on the question of how citizens perceive this situation, and the question of how much Poland and Hungary needs the funds, because they have been very much relying on particularly cohesion and common agricultural policy funds, if there is no agreement on the budget, and we know that there is an agreement very close and that there might be a compromise, but wouldn't be actually something that could maybe have a negative impact on the perception citizens have of their own government? And I'm thinking about how this could affect to the elections in Hungary in 2022. And I'm thinking about how, in the case of Poland, you have recent elections, so that would be very, very difficult. But in a very complex political situation, especially now when we have seen demonstrations for months, to what extent this could actually have a further push for citizens to oppose the government that they have, because it will also have economic consequences. So maybe we can start with Andrea with a reaction with those data that you were mentioning before about the perception of citizens, and when we can go back to Blazej.
Yes, so thank you. It is a very great question, and you're right that Hungarians know that EU funds are very, very important for Hungary, but they also know that they are very, very important for the Hungarian government in building this corrupt and anti-democratic system. So the problem of the Hungarian opposition is that EU funds are not properly spent, and EU funds don't get to those who really need those funds, but rather to friends of the government and so on. So of course, European funds are important, but there are problems, of course, with the spending of it. And also, I think that's why I said that this rule of law mechanism was or is a real threat to the government, because they as well know that before the election they will need that money. So about the data that I said, I just wanted to show you how good the government is in influencing government supporters and how much the supporters of the government follow Fidesz in mainly everything, I have to say, unfortunately. And a recent opinion polling published last week showed that that more than 80% of government supporters think that the rule of law mechanism and this whole debate is not about the European Union having problems with the state of rule of law in Hungary, but the European Union wanting to punish Hungary for not accepting illegal migrants to our country. So 85% of government supporters. This is a huge number, I think, and all in all, it means that half of the Hungarian population agrees with this view that the rule of law mechanism is about migration, and only, as I recall, 39% said that this is really about rule of law. So as you can see, half of the population agrees with the government. And also, if you see data on support for the government's action, Fidesz voters overwhelmingly think that the government is doing the right thing with vetoing MFF and rule of law mechanism and COVID-19 rescue funds. Of course, the opposition doesn't agree, but still, as Fidesz has many voters in Hungary, this means that half of the population are supporting Fidesz's actions. So that's how influential Fidesz is. Of course, it's partly or mainly because of the media machine, the propaganda machine that they created, partly from European funds and so on. So they can convince Hungarians well much more easily than the opposition, because they have more space, more opportunity to do this.
I will then probably ask you about a little bit of a reflection, probably by the end, on how do we actually fight that when you have a country like Hungary that has completely destroyed the opposition and the independent media. How do you get out of there? Because definitely affects to every single debate that we have, no matter what it touches upon. But I'm going to move to Black now to have a reaction on how the situation is in Poland, how is the perception of citizens of the discussion, and to what extent do you think that losing access to EU funds could have an impact on the current government?
I think that this is a very interesting case because, as you probably know, Polish political spectrum is divided half to half. It was seen very good during last presidential elections, when the candidate from opposition, Rafał Trzaskowski, will receive more than 10 million votes, and it was really close to the result of current President Andrzej Duda. And the Polish society is deeply divided. It is divided also in terms of geography, because voters of the opposition of Rafał Trzaskowski are living mainly in big cities, and voters of Andrzej Duda and supporting of lower justice are living mainly on villages and on the province. But the support for Polish membership in EU is something wider and is also present in Polish province. In the last poll made by, I think, Kantar for the biggest Polish opposition TV, it shows that 87% of Poles are supporting Polish membership in EU. Of course, we can discuss what it means, but in general, the support for Polish presence in EU is really high. Also, many people from local communities, from villages, they see how EU funds are changing their local communities. They are receiving direct monies from EU, and I think that also from them this veto and problems with EU funds will be something very close to them. So I think that this veto will be also harmful for the people who are voting for law and justice. Therefore, I think that law and justice is now risking a lot, especially because Polish economy is not doing well. In fact, we have the lockdown now, and it will last probably till March, and it will be disaster for many small enterprises and small businesses. And the government really needs these funds, and in fact, really needs also this success to sign the agreement today. This is the paradox. Of course, there is also this narration made by Zbigniew Ziobro, the Minister of Justice, and they are trying to show this problem as a fight of Polish sovereignty, and they are starting to talk also about possible Polexit in future. But I think that still this is minority. This is dangerous for future. But I think that if law and justice will playing this card, they will be losing the support of people. And this is very, very important, I think, for political future of Poland.
It's very interesting how the situation is completely different from Poland to Hungary and how the perception of citizens changes so much. I wanted to come back to a broader perspective on some thoughts that Richard launched into the beginning of the conversation, and it's this need for a broader debate about the model of integration and this opt-in, opt-out possibility, because during the discussion about the rule of law, we have heard a lot of comments about whether this was actually the result of the enlargement policy of the European Union not being good enough, or to what extent the EU was very good in upholding human rights outside the European Union, but once the countries are in, there are not enough, strong enough tools to fight the threats to democracy and the rule of law that we have seen in these countries. So I was wondering, because I think it's an interesting discussion, but then at the same time, I wonder to what extent, if we get into this flexibilization of EU integration, and what we've seen in Hungary, in Poland, and in other countries, most of what they oppose has to do a lot with EU values and not so much with policies. To what extent we are actually undermining the EU and the EU values by doing this sort of flexibilization of the values that we can accept or not accept when we join the EU. So I wanted to have maybe a deeper reflection from Richard on this question, and a reaction from Andrea and Blazej on this possibility of flexibilizing the integration in the EU.
No, those are good points, Beatriz. And I certainly wasn't calling for a kind of a la carte Europe of ultra flexibility where people can pick and choose on the fundamental values. There has to be a common bedrock of agreement on basic normative values. But I still think within that framework, there is a case for exploring at least some areas within a modest scale. Within a modest scale, there is scope for exploring some areas of additional cooperation organized more on this kind of opt-in basis, which may be, I know, I realize it's very difficult to devise and design and implement in practice, but there may be ways of pursuing this more kind of opt-in logic as a way of freeing up some of the decision making. This was the dilemma we were asked to reflect upon. And it seems to me rather than just focus on one issue and two member states, we need to recognize there's a broader kind of structural issue here about integration, and it's a very, very difficult balancing act. Personally, I don't like the idea of a kind of sharp division between an inner core and an outer core. This two-speed Europe has been around for decades and decades and decades, and every time it's raised, people then recognize the potential downsides of it. So I agree with you, there needs to be a common set of normative foundations, but on that, there may be kind of additional top-ups to the integration process that can be devised in a way that try and provide governments with an incentive to adhere more to those kind of core democratic values. If I may just add one other thing, Beatriz, reflecting the discussion you've been having, to me it seems that one thing the EU really needs to get to grips with is this distinction between democracy and the rule of law on the one hand and conservative values on the other hand. It seems to me that what's happening is that there are perfectly legitimate conservative identities being advanced in some member states, and those are being used in a rather disingenuous way as a pretext for undermining the rule of law and democracy. So hence Orban is able to mix up these things like gender ideology on the one hand and the rule of law on the other hand. And I think there the EU needs to tackle this in a more head-on way, because these conservative ideologies, one may disagree with these ideologies, but they contain elements that are a legitimate part of the political spectrum. And I think the EU would be helped if it was able to say, the EU is not kind of intrinsically, it doesn't have an intrinsic kind of political ideology or political identity, but the core values of democracy and rule of law go beyond those where one is positioned on a political spectrum.
That is a fair point, but I must say as well that also what we have seen in the EU over the past few years is trying to uphold the most progressive kind of way these values, and this is something that we have seen particularly in the past few months on gender, but also on LGTB. And I think it's an interesting move in itself. And going back to that, it goes back to the question of, and this is something that is more philosophical about the fundamentals of the EU, and it has been this question, so to what extent the EU should be protecting the rights to those standards for all EU citizens when in their countries they cannot get those rights as well. But this is a more philosophical question that we might have. I would like to give the floor now to Andrea, maybe for a reaction on this question of whether you think that there should be a flexibilization process of integration.
Yes, indeed, it is a great point. My main point would be that what I find the most important is that basic values of the European Union should be enforced on countries even after the EU accession. So what the discussion is about or has been about for years is that it's not right that we have all those criteria for joining the European Union, but once you're in, no one cares what is happening in your country. Of course, it's an exaggeration, but you know, the message for the Hungarian people over the last few years has been that our prime minister can get away with everything. So of course, there always debate at Brussels. There always criticism coming from the European Union, but there was never real consequences of the government's actions coming from the European Union. So every time there is a debate like this with the rule of law mechanism, opposition voters get maybe optimistic that maybe finally this is the time when Viktor Orban can't get away with taking EU institutions and the whole European Union hostage, and then slowly turns out that yes, he can get away with it, and he can get himself a deal that will be beneficial for him. So I think the most important thing for the future of the European Union would be to hold member states accountable and enforce those basic values.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm gonna take you for a quick follow-up, because one of the questions that I saw in our Q&A is actually addressed to you. It's from Ricardo Silvestre, and he asked you, we're seeing voting intentions for law on for peace in Poland dropping rapidly. However, in Hungary, Fidesz has a residual small decrease and very far from democratic coalition, but they are not comparable. Why do you think it's that difference?
Yes, it is a great question. Well, yes, now we see a slight decrease in the support for Fidesz, but I have to say it's due to the COVID-19 pandemic and not the veto, the fight with the European Union, in my opinion. What we're seeing in Poland is different because, well, Blazej will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Poland we see a less fragmented opposition than in Hungary. At least the liberal opposition, the liberal side of the opposition might be a little bit more united than in Hungary, and in Poland we see one major contender against Law and Justice Party, but in Hungary we see that of course, it might not mean a lot for you, but we see Democratic Coalition, which is the party of our ex-Prime Minister, Ferenc Gyurcsány. We see Momentum head-to-head as the biggest opposition parties, and we see other middle-sized opposition parties like the Socialist Party or the more right-wing Jobbik Party. So, but all in all, the opposition and the government is head-to-head, just like maybe in, or not just like, but similar to what we're seeing in Poland. So according to Republican Institute's poll in November, we saw that party voters are split evenly between the government and the united opposition. Of course, there is no such thing in Hungary right now as a united opposition, but we see the intention from 6 opposition parties to join forces for the general election 2020. And if you aggregate the support for these 6 parties, you will see, a more happy picture about party preferences in Hungary. But indeed, it's true that the support for the government parties are very constant, and we haven't seen much of a drop in their support in the last, I should say, 5 years now or 6. So it's quite a long time. And as I said, that very strong propaganda machine that they built, a very effective communication system that they created is helping them a lot to always control the public discourse, always control what the main issue of internal politics is. So they can do it, and of course it's partly because of the partial incapacity of the opposition, but now we see some developments on the opposition side. So I think we will see the race tightening in the next few months and the next year.
Interesting how they can control the narrative, but something like a pandemic, it goes way beyond their control, and therefore you see there the reaction of the citizens. But yes.
Because it's a very good point. This year with the COVID-19 pandemic was the first time for the government when they couldn't really control the narrative, and we saw that it resulted in a bit of a chaos in the government side. Also the scandal around József Szájer, our MEP, and everything. So these are problematic times for the government, but with this whole, as I mentioned, with this whole veto fight, they took the control back, basically. That was one of the reasons behind this whole fight.
Drifting the attention away. Maybe Blazej, a reaction on this question of flexibilization of integration process and maybe on the question of elections.
Yes, first of all, I would like to agree with Andrea that the most important thing is that basic values of democracy and rule of law should be universal for the whole EU. And I think that EU should have some tools to force it. And this is very, very important. However, if we are talking about this flexible model of integration, I think that, of course, this is best solution for the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And I think that it will be also harmful for the whole community. I still believe that law and justice government is just a dark episode in the Polish road to achieve the full liberal democracy. But I also believe that this flexibility in integration is a bad solution for the whole union. It may lose its cohesion. It can lose more the transparency in taking decision. I think that it can also deepen the feeling in many countries of many citizens that they are excluded from this small club rule that is ruling the heart of EU, and it would harm the sense of European community. I think that this flexible model in long term can destroy the EU as the club as big as this is now, and it will have also bad consequences in terms of geopolitics and the strength of the whole community in the world. I think that we are in a very difficult international moment when the increasing power of China, of Russia, also unstable situation of United States, it all should make us to consider that our unity and making the whole EU a strong community is something very important, and also this small heart of EU should consider also these countries on peripheries as are very important. I still believe that we can change the political situation in Poland. I think that we can change also the political situation in Hungary. We need some time, and we need the help from EU. And one of this of such a help can be the common fight for the rule of law in Poland and in Hungary, supported by EU structures.
I think it's very interesting, this question, because Richard was mentioning before this dichotomy between accessing the EU is in a way being closer to a set of values and we can progress in terms of rights, whereas for some people, and it has been very much the case in Hungary, and it's something that the government has used a lot, is a threat to their own values and to their own idea of nation. I wanted to jump into the other questions that we have in the chat and maybe ask you to do a little bit of a wider reflection, because we're running out of time. I cannot believe I have so many questions still. The question is from Rupinder Singh. He's asking, what is the risk of contagion for other not so new EU member states? And is the EU enlargement to Western Balkans dead due to fatigue from all member states? And together with that, I would like to ask you about something that you were reflecting right now. How do we go back from this? How do we go back to a full functioning democratic system in countries like Hungary, like Poland, like Bulgaria, Romania, and so on and so forth? So maybe to close up together. I know it's a very deep reflection I'm asking for, and a very difficult one. But I hope you can give me some ideas of how we can save European democracy. Maybe you can start, Richard.
I think it's a good point to remind us that problems over the rule of law and broader democratic quality are not limited to Hungary and Poland, nor are they limited to Central and Eastern European states. There are many indices that show declining democratic quality in Western European states, as well, EU and non-EU European states, by the way. So all these countries have problems. It is true, of course, that perhaps not to the same degree as in Hungary and Poland at the moment, but the fact that there is this broader problem of democratic quality, I think, increases the difficulty of the EU designing policy responses. And it does increase the importance of not limiting those policy responses just to one or two states, but the EU does need to have a broader approach. I know the rule of law report was a response to that, and it did highlight problems across a number of member states, but there isn't really any concrete policy follow-up to that. So I still think that's a challenge. While we're all looking at the need for firmer responses on Poland and Hungary, let's not forget that there are these more kind of second order problems that still do need to be addressed in other member states as well.
Thank you so much. And I think this is something that we have seen the debate with the latest developments, even in France, and we saw before that in Spain a couple of years ago. So it's definitely a discussion that we need to have, not only about the Eastern countries, but about the whole European Union as a whole. Maybe, Andrea, a reaction on this?
Yes, well, I agree with Richard that, of course, from a Hungarian point of view, as a Hungarian, it's easy to only focus on Hungary and Poland because, of course, our countries are really connected right now and allies in the European Union, but also deal with other member states as well. Well, I would like to maybe focus on the second part of the question concerning EU enlargement and the effects of current problems in the European Union on the EU enlargement. And I think it's a, yes, I think it's a real danger. Of course, I think when the European Union now has serious problems in dealing with current member states and figuring out how to move forward, how to restructure maybe decision making, funding, and everything else. It is really hard to focus on enlargement and in accepting more member states. And of course, for old member states now see mainly Poland and Hungary, but maybe Bulgaria and Slovenia joining the party, sees these new member states as troublemakers in the European Union. So it would be understandable that they would not want to create more problems or more possibilities for problems in the European Union. So I think, first of all, the EU should settle these current issues within the current member states, and then, of course, would be energy and time and will for EU enlargement, possibly. But first of all, yes, I think now it is not easy to make an agreement between current member states, unfortunately.
I think it's very interesting, this point of we should first settle the issues that we have internally in the EU before we can actually try to enlarge into other countries, and especially to ask them to uphold human rights or democracy or rule of law that we're not being able to enforce at EU level. Blazej, maybe a final reflection.
Well, I'm aware that EU enlargement now is, of course, very difficult and not possible. But I think that we should also discuss about long-term perspective. And in long-term perspective, the EU enlargement means bringing democracy and some universal human rights standards to new countries and new places. And I think that in long perspective, it is important for the whole European community. And I'm not calling for doing it now, because we have very big problems. And I think that firstly, we have to do our job inside EU. But yes, I think that EU enlargement is something very important. in terms of geopolitics, in terms of exporting the wealth, in terms of exporting the standards and human rights. And I think that it always should be the aim for European leaders to achieve the next steps of enlargement, of course, in long perspective.
This question of EU being a soft power. I would like to thank you all for your interventions today. I think it was a very interesting discussion. We talk about the importance of the rule of law mechanism and the link to EU funds, but also the contradictions that these can bring into the conversation, particularly in those countries that are more affected by it, precisely because of the control of the narrative of the government in these countries over the years. The EU being used as a scapegoat. This is something that we have seen in Hungary, but we have seen, unfortunately, in other countries as well. And this brings us back to the question that upholding human rights and democracy is not only an Eastern European issue, it's an European issue, and we definitely need better mechanisms within the EU to make sure that we protect human rights, that we protect democratic values and the rule of law. And with this message that we would definitely need to pass to the EU leaders meeting today in Brussels, I would like to give the floor back to Daniel for a final closing remark. Thank you again, everyone, for your intervention. It was a lovely debate.
Thank you very much indeed for this highly interesting debate, for the very strong and partly also a bit controversial points, I think, that were raised today. So Andrea, Blazej, and Richard, thank you so much for being with us, and Beatriz, like always, for the fantastic moderation. But as you said, Beatriz, it is indeed timely, and I think it's really time to stand up for the values of the European Union, that the European Union stands for, and the European Union needs to stand up for itself. As you mentioned, it needs to get out of this good old tradition of being the scapegoat domestically. When something is going well with EU funds, it is the domestic leaders who do that. If something's going not that well, it's all the EU's fault. I think that's a narrative that we all know too well, and I think that's something that we need to get out of. And yes, we have a difficult situation at the moment. Of course, there's this sweet poison of qualified majority that there is in the room. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a democratic system with checks and balances. And I think this situation right now is the best argument for a strong European Parliament, for a proper implementation of reforms to strengthen the Parliament, and also a proper initiative right for the European Parliament and the consequences that follow with that. So while Poland and Hungary have been in the focus and will be in the focus for a while, I would also like to touch briefly on one thing that Andrea also hinted to, and that's the CVM, a controlling verification mechanism that has been active for Bulgaria and Romania since their joining of the European Union. The European Union has shown to be a toothless tiger, especially when it comes to the issue of fighting corruption and standing up for rule of law. If you look at the Prime Minister Boyko Borisov in Bulgaria, who has been Prime Minister for the most of the time, he has been actively leading the country down a negative road, making things worse on the ground if you read any report, including the one from Reporters Without Borders. And the European Union has shrugged its shoulders, say, what can you do? Well, now we would have something that we can do something with, and that is the rule of law mechanism directly ties where it hurts, money. And I think that is why we need to fight and to stand up for that. And whilst the European Union does not have an ideology, and we have more conservative and more liberal countries, we need to be united in diversity. But we need to have common principles, and rule of law is one principle that we cannot and should not get around. And I really hope that the EU gets out of this narrative of running in every trap that is being laid out for it. We have seen it internally and externally. We have seen it with Poland and Hungary, with the big celebrations, Andrea, as you mentioned, in Hungary now. But we have also seen it in the external dimension, just looking at Russia, for instance, and how Russia has played the European Union over the years. Again, something that is connected to rule of law, and hopefully the recently adopted Magnitsky Act will do something about that in the end. Again, but this takes courage. How we can solve that, what we can do about it, the European Liberal Forum has had a number of consultations called the expert fora, and we will be proposing a liberal white book, Europe 2030, to show how a liberal Europe can look like and what the steps are that we need to take for that. So please look forward to that. It will be published very soon. While you might be bored in the Christmas time and think, hey, I really want to do something and read something and hear something about politics, I would like to recommend you the Liberal Europe podcast with our good friend Ricardo Silvestre as the host. We'll be launching a new edition next week, the Christmas edition, but there are fantastic editions already from throughout the year and from last year that all are all worth listening. Please listen and watch our Thought Bite videos where our MEPs from the Renew Group give perspective on contemporary issues about rule of law. We have our amazing Ramona Strugariu, who already said something about that. So please check it out on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And last but not least, if you're really looking for fantastic Christmas gifts, or if you think, hey, I would really like to know more about the future of work, future of social welfare systems, or migration, please check out our publications on the website of the European Liberal Forum. With that, I would like to do three things. Thank again the fantastic panel and Beatriz. Thank you for being with us today as the audience, for listening and asking the question. And last but not least, wish you all Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, much health, and for all of us that we get out of this situation with the lockdown, hopefully very soon. With that, thank you all and see you soon.